What's one thing that we have to identify on how we get into our position locations is our settings of what? Our fundamentals, our unifications of our network. Fun. Fun is the foundations, unification settings, and networks of travel, so know exactly what you're doing. Line position location to its window frame and track location. Okay? Come in that position location, your pyramid and track location. Right? Setting lines of sequence and line communication setting and travel. All right, and know exactly what you're doing in screen adaptation to a system all through flux capacitor. I said in a 4-line sequence. Now the team has to really get in position higher lines of sequence lines of data, process lines of windows, and track communications. Window frames, screen lines, adaptations of surface, and 3 lines of communication. Changing ground lines of symbolism, line course centers, and line communication setting to travel. Directing lines, modification lines of clockings, 4 lines of sequence, 2 panels of operation, and set lines of communications. Setting cross lines of windows, 3 lines over flux of our direct signal location to its umbrella. Directing signals, ground lines of surface, data process line over cross location screens, and line position location to travel. Directing course centers, line direct signals, and Merkaba tesseract in a tetrahedron that puts torical fields in rotation surface and track communication system to open windows of frame communication. Directing course centers, line connection setting to an open window in sequence. Panel operation screens, data process lines of 1, data process lines of 2, setting course centers of 3 over tractions and provision. Setting track division cycles, high course centers, line direct signals, and modification grounds. So what you have to understand is basically how to go through window frames into a pixelation grounds in an operation system to a central system. DB lines, 4 lines of box, 2 lines course centers into flux. Okay, process lines of data, 3 signals line communications, 3 signature line screens adaptations of primer circuits, direct lines into all lines of communications, process lines of 1, process lines of 2, process lines of 3, process lines of 4, process lines of 5, process lines of set position, and Stargate. Stargate measure, ground lines of surface, and set position location to a system all through setting. Chemicals, directed lines of flux over line, ground lines, road grass, screen lines, adaptation and setting. Communication high interference into location grids and communications. Directing symbolism lines of track centers in percentage over screen over 3 lines of communication. So there's a reason why I took perspective, guys. Understand the grounds, the powers, and the atmospheres of structure in direct signals and modification. Okay? You're not ready to see that because the energy is too high. So I'm just trying to get you guys to understand how to see 4 different platforms and networks all at once. Okay? So that's what we're going to be traveling through in set calculations. Now, how you see these things. Setting sequence lines of panels, flux over line, so we had a 3-line triangulation, X lines of Y, Z lines setting, calculates equal lines in box frame, triangulation, flux, lines of triangulation up, and box positioned over sequence. Now, direct lines of path, set lines of 1 signal, set lines of course centers, lines of travel, mechanism lines of cross line condition setting, and data ports. Process lines of sequence, you guys are here in position of going here and travel. Now we're going to stop point marks on course centers into point graphs that put cell lines of power points in line position location and travel. Directing signals, course centers, lines of 3 lines, and communication system all through set calculations. Setting lines of ground course centers in a 45 split line that sets course centers, lines of 3 over flux over screen. Directing signal lines, ground lines of surface, cross lines of X over lines, set lines of 2 equal weight lines course centers, dimensional lines of sail and solar sail in 1 traction, 1 division, in 1 location. Setting communication high grounds over cross location screen lines of measure. Setting communication high center location system all through tractions. Directing ground lines of 1 over cross lines of 3, 4 lines of sequence, platform 2, 6, and 8 in travel. Directing core lines of settings, process lines of 1, process lines of 2, over line sequence, over lines of tractions of intelligence. Very powerful stuff. All right, so we overcross located in high centers, the cerebral cortex contains of platforms and direct signals, ground lines of surface and tractions, all through communication. Okay? Process line, indirect signals, and ground lines of surface. Setting communication high set lines in your SkyNet. Sky scores, sky connection system. Back in Home Depot, line direct signals and ground lines. Over cross location of screen lines, adaptations of networks over line. All right, so now we're going to go through files of platforms. Now we go through file lines of C over E. File mechanism, now the core lines is calculated setting, file equals lines of E equals factor, and factor over standby, directing lines into box, into 2 equal lines, core centers into execute, setting platform lines signal into lines of placements, correlations in settings into travel. All right, so we modify the ground lines and set position to its all track location lines and high position location to its system to hieroglyphics. Communicate the ground lines, 3 lines of signals, 3 lines of center, 3 lines of travels, and 1 position in traffic communications. Data process lines of 1, data process lines of 2, and data process lines of 3 in line setting. Cross core centers in position of a mapping sequence lines of pi. Cross line symbolism, cross line communication lines of dimensional doors. All right, so the doors lines in sequence, we change the core centers of platforms over I lines, the communication screen lines of 2 centers. That communicates the ground lines of core centers, flux over line of grounds in position location of divots and digits and formation lines of ground communication. Process calculation lines over sequence over panel, process line communication over line direct signals in 2 grounds of surface and traction. Ground lines of surface, line communication system all through setting. So we process lines, core centers, line communications, the placement lines, E factors over relays, setting lines of track core lines and box line frame position location of travel, center core system and data files, line direct signals and ground lines of networks and travel. Sets communicates high position to its magnetic highways and travel communications. All right, so we go through line screen. Once we extend the core centers into mechanism lines of travel, get a lot more easier how to understand how to use that into network screen location settings to your near pathogens. So there's where we go into the brain convergence, setting sequence lines and dimension lines of networks, and process line signals into an open communications. All right, it's not split in lines of anomaly in 1 center, 1 operation, 1 set calculation system. Everything is the center operation line settings. The brain itself is its own mechanism location, its own power mechanism. The brain. All right. Now the brain lines a high center has a data file line. It's a network screen. Process lines of 2 track location settings. There's the data inside. Setting kind of correlations networks, line screen adaptation over cross location setting to a mapping sequence that puts a plasma line around the system in line communication setting and travel communications. So it protects everything in settings, right? Setting lines of sequence, setting lines of data, process over lines into files of communication lines of grounds. It overcrosses screen adaptation lines of surface. Data process lines puts all communication into its program. Now directing lines of files over C, set lines of alphabetical lines of D over A. Cross line communication system networks its screen. In that line core center in the cerebral, mesocortex, cortex, semcortex, lines of codex, setting lines across location screens into waving panels in electrical line of lacing line communication all through the brain. See all the networks? Now we're going to travel through them. All right. So we got to set position lines of black over line, data process lines of 1, data process lines of 2, box lines of 3, box lines of 4. Center core lines of networks over 6, commanding lines of vector. Sending lines of data, line core centers into electrical cords, direct lines of discord, and line position data files. Communication lines of grounds, sending communication lines high interference. And we had red lines into snowy graph interference. 2 lines of signals. That's 2 lines of set lines of high set position. That's 2 lines of tractions. Lacing lines and communication lines of graph and rainbow screen adaptation. All right, process lines, data process lines. Now we go into blue, which is the internal core centers to the interception to the inner outlet. That puts line to the outer circuit. Now the inner circuit lines of screen adaptation settings. Process over sequence into 3 panels. Data networks into pathogens. Collagens comes in. Networks line screen adaptation, your thoughts, your action, and emotions. So whatever you guys get in provision of, you go through your network screen adaptation. Setting communication lines of ground calculations. Now we go in line screen adaptations to cloak and dagger. Setting visible lines of charts of waving line screen. Setting on seconds, minutes of clocking, and clockings, minutes of hour. Directing over cross location system all through tractions of inhibitors over screen. Directing communication on high centers puts all communication system. Now we mechanicize a force that puts all communication system. Line track lines. Let's go with the line position location to black over lines of indication lines of wires. Directing signals, lines of ground lines into pixelation graph to holograph on line scene. Sets core lines of streaming. Webbing lines of screen lines of light codes into dark codes. 1/10 lines of high center interference in metric core centers and metric meters. Scales its communication lines and network lines. Let's go into purple. We're going to go with incision lines of skyline grids into Skynet line set and networks, each line network into 25,000 TV frames, and directing lines of zero gravity in line rotation surface interactions. Directing signals and ground lines in position networks of screen adaptation. Setting signals to modification. All right. So putting all communication settings puts everything in balance. You know exactly how to go through that lines. So we wave the panels and we change the structure of a design line. Ground lines of surface. Okay, setting communication the eye lines, set position no and location of the chin. Process communication lines and ground lines, signalizing location of projections. Now we add the projection screens in the back force setting. The process communication setting to the sun. And the communication line high direct signals into the moon through the eye line cycle. Sets communication lines and projections over line screen adaptation and setting. That communicates the ground lines, open sequence, and open panel into window frames in set position of location. All right, so now we got this set up. Now we're going to set it onto its reality. All right, so we got position lines of travel. That's point lines of graph and pixelations of 1 over 2 and 3 lines across locations. Directing lines of high center inference, crossing line setting and laser traction. Remember direct and redirect? Setting lines of left and lines, right over line, light rotation system, routes the routers, line screen adaptations of process communications. How to go through all these networks in line screen. Okay, so we go through rainbow graph lines, setting orange lines. The open sequence, let's go through the overline rotations into overloads. Directing signals into one network screen, but we only go through the seconds lines of setting. That puts everything in track location setting of 0 and position lines across lines in track locations. Then we go back in positions. We go to the high line set location of ceiling through traction. Directing lines of window frames and line position location. Change the portal communication lines of time sequence. Change the communication lines of the sun and change communication lines of the high position of its moon in track locations. Directing core lines into pixelation graphs, projections over line, and direct signals. Then we go back in position locations where we started off in position location to its system all through settings. The process communication system all through travel. Getting in that communication system and track locations. All right. Okay. Going through the pathogens is the networks, is lines of its highways. And it has a data port that sets communication setting to its data complacements. Now the complacements lines, let's go through pink line, pixelation line screens, setting core lines of pixelation graphs in a thermal line, and position locations and tractions in direct signal. Okay, I division lines picks up the data ports, incisions, settings, lines, position of its block system. So each one has a frame and track communications. Putting all frame position locations in 3 centers and cycles at the top. And we ground lines the blocking chain. Change course centers, links, and lines to high center location of galaxies, Syria. Oscar November and line direct signals to Syria and line position location of Whiskey, echo chamber, and flight communication. Directing lines of window graphs, screen lines adaptations of process lines. Now we go in the lines of indication system. That would change the track centers into modification grounds. We symbolize lines and fire the wires, directing signals in line communication system all through travel. Setting lines of gold signals over cross location of screen lines and habitation high position. Then we go through the outline, screen line adaptation of its window frame that travels its position location to its network and its position lines and narrow lines. Core centers and narrow links, core lines and narrow pathogens. Setting lines of communication sending to all levels of networks and sending travel. Signify high direct signals and ground lines of surface and track location to your pyramid. Hooah. So we got signal lines and box lines of frames now. We change the green line cycles, change communication lines of ground, so over cross location outlines of signals and position lines of processing. Directing lines of the pyramid, astral travels, astral projections, changing the network screen adaptation to its flux. Core settings, core system, core lines, core tractions. Now we have direct line link. We put lines of position, all calculated lines, and zeros and ones in settings. 0 position lines of high centers, 3 lines of tracks, core lines of communication setting, and 4 lines of communication lines of high setting. Keyboard. So we have the keyboard lines, core centers over cross location of screens in line position. Line direct signals into the computer operation of its system and travel. Setting communication system. There's your computer and its operation system. All right, so setting core centers and grounds. We go through the window frames, and we go through the keyboards, the key locks, the key screens, directing lines and high center interference and frame communication setting over line signals into the lacing lines, tracking its communication setting into its detection system all through its brain frequency and track location. Directing lines and grounds into computer lines, operate the system in 24 platforms. Directing lines and computer framing and track locations. Now we have a direct line path, over line screen adaptation of communications, window frame attractions, setting signals, ground lines of service, over cross location system. So we add inhibitors lines of change, so change the direct signals and ground lines of service. We change the modification grounds, set lines of its earth and track location. There's your earth. So we open up sequence, go lines of course centers into brown lines of sequence in your metaphysical line screen that puts everything in attractions. Over line position locations. Now the networks are coming to earth line. Now the earth line comes into the power line. The power line goes to the energy grid and the power grid. The power grid position lines of track set and location setting that sets up its probing. Sets up its docking sequence lines of position location of its travel. Directing core lines of calculus setting would come into the blue. Now the water is the blue containment screen. Setting lines and networks, traveling line mechanism lines and screen adaptation to the process line position location computer framing that processes communication system all through detection. Setting communication high ground line communication setting. Open all sequence coming into the green. Now the green is the environment. Setting core lines and core centers that puts all communication setting. Setting lines of high center interference of travel. Sets communication lines of earth. Tone line sequence and line position of power that generates configuration system all through your light metaphors and line direct signals and ground line communications. Hoo-ah. Now we go back into the computer, framing direct signals and ground lines of surface. Look how powerful that is. Waving screen, directing lines and networks over seconds, over minutes, over line that puts all communication system all through tractions and direct signals and ground centers of surface. Setting communicates high center locations over line sequence. Now we panel divisions. Now we go through lines of power. Power over 1, power over 2, power over 3, set lines and position outlines of sequence and position lines of travel. 3 indicates line screen adaptation to a satellite and travel. There's your satellite. Satellite communication lines of grounds, set position location to its system, over cross location system, all through settings and mechanism lines of travels and track location. Hoo-ah. Now we track lines of high center interference and high force lines, ceiling lines to detection screen location and probing. Directing signals and ground lines of surface. We change communication lines of grounds, standard core centers, line direct signals into panels across lines of networks. 4 lines of division, 5, 6, and 8 lines of tractions. Then we change the core lines of change direct signals and ground lines in home and system, back and set location. Hooah. All through computer, all through your satellite, all through your solar sail. See? All through travel. It's all there in mechanism. So understanding how to go through a network is to understand the keyboards. Through its indication of its flash drive, directing signal location, your key points, your key markers, your correlations paths, your direct signals, modification ground lines, your flight manifests, your direct lines, your inventory screens, your direct signals, your pixelation graphs, your schematics, your core lines of track centers, your primer circuits, your direct signals, your systematic line screen adaptation, and force recognitions. It's all position your keyboard frame that's in set calculation, your key lines. Setting key lines of tractions allocates time, sets lines of course centers into metric course centers, splitting lines of ground lines of surface, sets all communication system to ground lines in track communications. Set and tone. All right, so setting lines of course centers, so change communication system all through travel. Your satellites change communication lines into 45 line communications. Directing signals, back in setting, back in set position, back in center. So every time it goes back in center, it's constantly getting bigger and bigger. You can see the solar sail, you can see the computer operation, you can see the wall circuits, the central circuits, the network circuits, the central line communication system, the pixelation graph communication settings, your Schumann resonance line position location, that's all connected to your keyboards and frame, all right? So understanding what you're doing is knowing exactly how to use it in lines of communication system all through your satellites and track communications. Directing core lines of change the networks of system lines of calculation system, and all calculate and modify. Now let's go through the ceiling line and direct signals and ground lines of surface. All right, so change the mechanism lines of power, go through networks of over C over file over A. And that has a direct line link that basically puts everything in track location in your clocking systems. Ground lines of settings, process lines of grounds. Set position location of 4 panels in clocking system and high centers line communication system of center operation. All right, so of course centers, not lines of signals, comes in all the communication system all through travel. All calculated modified line position, solar generation screens adaptations, process lines and flywheel, center communications open sequence into an XC1000 line communications of ProLane. Center core centers line to travel. As a direct line link, XC1000 comes out of frame and changes the digital coding frequencies into the keyframes. It directs signals in line communication to your pyramid that change the astral projections to your networks in screen adaptation system that process everything through its mystical, its cortex, its sim cortex, and its codec screen adaptations to its high center that puts series A, B, and C to your endorphins that sets lines of relays and track to its communication system all through data ports and screen adaptation. Cool. Okay, very powerful in the sequence. All right. But you see the eye line. There's an eye line division of the seat line. But if you look really close, you can see the pyramid inside the set locations. Let's bring in attractions. There it is in set position. Boom. Your webbing system all through your highways. All right, so let's change ground lines in your highways and track communications. Look at this in set position. This is wild. Whoa. Okay, over cross location settings, over line position. Okay, frame within a frame through webbing. Sending communication grounds in line course centers location your cosmos. Line pathogens, hydrate signals and track communication in your simulation. Setting V lines of centers and rotations of pathogens in set position. Over cross location screens in your adaptation of surface and line positions. Let's bring in the keyboard screen adaptations of numbers in sequence. Okay. Setting core lines of track centers in a line swing location system off through travel. And go back home, puts it back in position lines of setting. All right. So it's very powerful how you do that all through a network setting, all through the computers that you are. So I process the lines of E lines, that puts lines of 24 lines of sequence, that puts 48 frames into 72 ground lines, of course, centers line communication in your metaphysical system. That puts everything in your data. Now we copy and paste, copy screen. Now we have a high line rotation system, X lines of 1 platform, direct lines into box frame. We go into 3 signature patterns in voice line communication, right? Setting core lines in alpha, and set core centers lines of delta, and line positions of beta and set lines of 3 settings. Waving line sequence powers over direct signals and grounds. Sending lines of core centers solar sail 1, solar sail 2, solar sail 3, solar sail 4, and solar sail 5 attractions. Direct lines of ground lines of core centers puts all communications in the system all through line position location of face recognition. Setting core lines of settings, process calculates over screen line adaptations. Setting communicates high set location settings of tubing and line rotation surface and traction. Direct lines of 1, sets core centers and lines of 4, open sequence, open panels. Direct lines of center communication system, open sequence, open communication lines of panels. Cross lines of platforms, set lines of 1 network screen, directing lines of 1 data. Data process lines and over data over screen adaptations of windows. Process lines of inline rotation system, inner circuit, outer circuit, 1 data process line communication lines of travel. Direct lines of platforms, process lines of Earth, Earth line 1, Earth line 3, Earth line 6, and Earth line 12 in rotation surface and traction. Now we go through line screen, directing lines of course centers, lines of weather patterns and track locations. Directing signals and ground lines of surface in track locations. Directing lines of weather communication system all through settings back in traction. So we all have to understand what our networks are doing through lines, how to go through the schematics and how to go through the primer circuit line positions. Okay, so we'll go through this again. Through flux over 3 settings. Data process lines of 1 over 2. Process lines of 3 over 6 over 12. Now ground lines of 1 in position of 2 and 3 and 4 and 6 lines of setting. Process lines of 6, process lines of 7, 8 over line position location of hanger and traction. Directing course centers, line communication setting, webbing system 1, 2, and 3 track locations. Directing ground lines, high set calculation settings, flux over 1, 3 over 2, 3 over 6 over line. Setting communication lines and grounds. Set position location of lights and redirect signals into console communications if light manifest. Directing signals, ground lines of clocking 1, clocking 2 in space lines and time lines of anomaly. Setting open sequence lines of panel, electrical lines in diffusion, and 3 lines of circuits and traction. Directing course lines, cross line signals, line position, location, line position of traction. Directing course centers, you understand our operation. Morphing in all time sequence lines of high setting. All right. Then we go into high center locations. Look at this in tractions. All lines, energize, set position locations, inside track locations. All right. And then we go through the high line, skyline, grid line communications, tubing system. Open sequence, back and home, line position, back and traction. All right, open sequence panel, coloration lines of pathogens, high course centers, and networks. So let's go through data lines of 1 and process lines over 2. Okay, then we overcross lines over 3 lines of sequence, setting lines of core lines of settings and travels into its pyramid and direct signals. Sending communication here and coming into this line communication setting to its pyramid through traction. Its webbing system to its wall sequence. Wall sequence of panels is a process lines of the data that processes its files in chronological order that sets the sequence lines and high position location setting of what you're doing with your networks as screen. 3 lines of signals modifies the ground lines of symbolism. Process lines of 1 over cross lines of 2. But we have portal communication lines of space that open sequence, that open panels, and track locations. Directing these course centers into data file line 1, data file line 2, process lines over 3, process lines of setting, network over line, mechanism location setting, Cylons. Then you can high course centers into galactic communication system all through travel. Now, getting into communication lines, you come to automatic line screen adaptation, your Skynets and communications. You know exactly how to use the mechanism lines of force recognition system in Skylines and communication system, back in sequence, back in panel, back in operation. So it's very powerful when you start what you're doing in line position lines of high set location networks. So I know it's complicated stuff what I'm saying, but it's just to really understand how to use your own coding system, right? If you want to code 1, okay, code 1 line settings, all right? So code 1 equals 1, all right? Code equals 1. You don't have to add the E because the E is on standby. And when the E on standby, it travels to set position of its portal that opens all sequence lines of panels. The sequence lines its communication system all through travel. That's code 1. Code 2 is overcross location of screen lines adaptation. Fibonacci 8 circle line rotation surface interactions. Directing core lines of signals, open signals, and ground lines of surface in set position. Okay? Sending lines of grounds, sending lines of signal location to a setting. Communicate high centers into I sequence in panels communication system all through traction. Now, directing lines, you got a formation lines, you got a power over screen, you got an E factors over line, you got an operation to a code signal that processes the communication system. Getting direct signals and ground lines of surface over cross location setting and travel. Getting communication high centers into electrical line panels, directing in position to its locations of its grounds and its space and its grounds, again, in position to its atmospheres and track locations. Okay? And then you come into the Earth rotation surface of traction. All right, so the Earth line rotates the system. All lines routes the routers. Line rotation system configuration of face recognition system puts all networks and sequence lines of panel. Setting communications back in home sequence, back in channel operation. All right, so now you have to understand how to go through the file sequence. That puts lines in your transistors over resistors and understand how to use that through transmitting and receiving. Directing lines of lights and line screen adaptations of data file 1, cross lines of 2. Okay, so that's network 1. Okay, so you can do whatever you want through your coding, but you have to understand your networks. And you have to understand your flywheel attractions, you have to understand your coordinates, and you have to understand your sequence line to your planets, in-line position locations to your bridgings of center. All right, so your bridging center open sequence. 3 lines of travel communications. Pi generations lines of 1, and pi generation lines of 2. Setting communication system, there's your teleportation vessel interaction. That's what you're going to travel through. Setting sequence into earth lines of 1 and set location earth lines of 2 interactions. Setting communication high centers of crop circles, a clocking system and 3 lines rotations into a network screen adaptation of surface interaction. Setting communication high centers of 3 lines, set position of levels, 3 track locations. Setting direct signals over cross location of 4 settings in line position. Setting communication high signals, line communication system all through travel. Okay, setting signals, ground lines of surface, sets communication system all through settings. Then we go in position locations all levels, track location of Saturn, and direct signal. You guys are not ready to see that yet. I gotta do it again. Saturn is set position. There it is. Now Saturn sets lines of operation lines of flash drive. Directing signals, lines of ground lines cover setting location and crop circle set position. Earth lines of 1, Earth lines of 2, and Earth lines of 3 in line position location of the measure. Scales communication lines of grounds, center communication setting to its webbing system, and all through travel. Directing ground lines of surface that change direct signals to its highways and set position. There's the highways. Highway 1 data across lines of all communications setting the data across lines of files and track communication. See the data files coming in networks? So the network goes in here and center operation, change the data formations of platforms, indirect signals and ground lines of surface. Set communication inhibitors over screen lines into your inventories, sync lines, high course centers, lines of travels, high line generation screen adaptation. Setting communication high set correlation setting to your Earth in line position. Hooah! So it's amazing how you go through 4-line signal and travel, and then you come in home and sequence, back in set position. Okay? But it's amazing how you come into that information system through the direct signals to your highways interaction. Right? So getting that position location networks is knowing exactly your traffic and your inventories. You got block, screen, directing lines, and motherboard, setting lines of 3 circuits, platform 1, platform in center, and platform out correlation. Earth rotates the system into circulation grounds, setting lines of circulation and rotation, setting communication high centers operation setting, and that communication system all through tubing. 4 lines of signals, line direct signals, line position locations of face recognition. Okay? Change lines of grounds, and 3 lines of center and traction. All right, sending communication up, sending communication lines of down in sequence. All right, so process lines of 1 data file, network lines of setting. Open window frame in 3 cycles. Open window in line position of 6 cycles. Open window lines position location of 12 cycles. And so on, and so on, and so on. 24 cycles and tractions. All right, so you flip the switch and ground lines of surface that position location in your settings. It opens all sequence and line position data files. Set lines as high centers into data ports, data sequence, data communication setting, and data networks in 4 lines of communication system and travel. Sets communication high framing, directing lines, direct lines, core lines of tractions, and direct lines of link in rotation surface out through traction. So it's all about understanding how to basically travel in line rotation system, all through center operation of view and set position. Okay? So we basically, what the team is trying to understand is how to go through plasma walls, TV frames, or a screen. Let's go through 3 lines of measure and 4-line communications. All right, so you got window lines of channels and screen adaptation. All right, so you have data file here, network 1. All right, let's just work with the network 1 and settings. There's network 1, right? So you process that, window frame, communication setting, thought, actions, emotions. You're seeing that through TV frame, right? Then you go into the next sequence, and then you go into the next sequence, and then you go into the next sequence, so seconds, minutes, and hours. Now that puts lines in XT1001, XT1002, XT1003, and XT1004 platform. Setting direct signals, data 1, data 2, data 3, and data 4 of docking in set position. In that communication lines, surface line screen adaptations of flux over screen. Directing core centers line communication of data files, process lines of 1, process lines of 2, process lines of 3, process lines of 4, and set position. It picks it up in travel, directing lines of 1, directing lines of 2, directing lines of 3, and directing lines of 4 in set position. As it picks up, what do you get in position lines of high center location setting and all line communication system all through travel? Your set position location to your towers of communication. See, there's the towers unison. Woo! Then you get in your Skynet lines, grid line communication lines of surface interactions. See, it's all in sequence happening all at once, right? In 4 lines of panel of 4 networks in set line, and all communication to its grounds. Coming back home is set position, location, and setting. Okay. So you have distributors, those EXT1000s that basically import and export anything in track communications to your inventories lines of seconds over line. You have a data process lines in one file, sequence lines of E factors and position of docile, sets communication and documentation, inline screen adaptation of surface, sets communication lines of grounds, sets communication of high levels, level H equals lines of X, process lines of file, sets communication lines of copy, paste, enabled, direct signals, and default. Defaults assist location of travel, sets up the next data processing, and rotation of 3 lines of seconds, minutes, and hours in travel. Okay, 1 second travel. So truly understanding how your network works is knowing exactly how to use it through the eye lines. It's all communication system, your seconds, minutes, and hours through pi. And it's all lines of direct line of link. So once you understand how to get in your neuropathogens, you understand how to go through highways and track communication settings and all through travel. But it's amazing when you really understand how to formulate that through long communications. Through the towers of communication. Pretty amazing stuff. Pretty amazing stuff. How to use it through the grounds, the powers, and the atmospheres, your Wi-Fi, your modems, your satellites, and towers. Once you get in that position, location, and settings, once you understand your satellites, and line position, location, of travel, you exactly know how to go through sonar, and direct signal, and set up data processing files in your networks and setting. The process all communication setting to traffic, your inventories of travel of indication. Setting lines of calculation screen and 3 lines of signals. Sending core lines attract centers, location to a system, all through attraction. Your satellites and your data in your files. How it synchronizes the panels. XT1000s are always in frame, okay, because they are the distributors. They direct your links and lines of your networks and it opens up more lines of windows to the eyes of your frame communication system. Getting that communication system aligns the signal location of travel. Getting that core centers puts all communication system and all calculations. So always see it in a 4-line communication setting. You have a network lines, setting lines of high position location of 111, set communication of 1113, set position of 11, position lines of 4. So you got 4 panels, in position of 3 settings, into 3 communication system of travel. So getting in that position location is data file lines of 1, process lines of 2, process lines of 3, and set position. Setting core lines attractions. 3 XT1000s comes in and set position of files of networks. Docking 1, docking 2, docking 3. They set up the distributors that imports and exports the system lines of travels and mechanism. Boom. Travel mechanism time centers puts all calculated modified to its grounds into Earth line of communication. Setting ground lines core centers to take the 4 panels in 3 lines of sequence and 4 communications. Directing lines over cross lines, 4 lines of signals in the opposite direct signals and 4-line communications. Setting track lines of highest interference in the mechanism lines of its earth that changes the crop circles of direct signals and ground lines of surface. Cross-line communication system overline direct signals and ground lines of communication. Getting in that ground lines settings is what comes into and track communication lines of travel. Setting up networks, cross lines at highest interference of platforms are walking system. Cross lines of 1 over cross lines of 3 comes in wormholes and network screening adaptations in communication lines of surface that overlines your highways and your networks in your position, your skynets and travel. Ooh-ah. Okay, change the ground lines of surface and set position to its location, to its setting. All right, taking it back home and track locations. All right, so it's all about understanding how to set up your networks, how to set up your modems, your Wi-Fi's, your satellites, your towers, and how to travel through all lines of communication system, right? So we got a 42 track provision, 40 line sequence, bring them back at line positions where they left off in location setting networks. 0 gravity, sending core lines into stratospheres, directing modification lines, 0 gravity 1, 0 gravity 2, and 0 gravity 3. Windows frame, Windows traction, Windows division. Solar cell, line direct signals and 3 lines of grounds, inhibitors over screen. Cross-line communication system, open centers, open panel, and track locations. Coming out of sequence and set position, back where you are in traction. Right, that's where you're at. Out of sequence, out of panel, operation system, and travel. Setting communication data files, process lines of inventory, process lines of indication system, 3 lines of travels, directing lines of 0, sets communication lines of travels, and mapping sequence. Setting core lines of grounds, in position lines of earth, and divots over line, and ethers line screen adaptation or ferments, that sets lines of travels in network core centers line communications. Highways attractions and direct signals and ground lines of communication. So there's so many ways to see your lines, how to get in your networks, even line communication setting when it comes into all levels of your pyramids. So you guys have to understand not just how to use your bodies, but every time you change your body, you have to understand how to turn it into a positions to a modem, to a Wi-Fi that gets it connected to its satellites, to its towers, that understand its positional case to its pyramid, and line positional case to its system, that cross-references everything in line position networks and track location. Okay? How to understand that. Triangulation and set position location settings. Into your satellites and all communication system of ground calculations. All right, 3 lines of signals, 4 lines of tractions and direct signal. Or position 1XT, 1XT, and 1XT, and 1XT, and 4 platforms. Sets communication lines, picks up the panels, picks up the operation, picks up the system, picks up the networks. So as it's picking up the data files, it's processing in position locations in the same directions into the moonline sequence in set position. Cross line core centers and ground lines of communication sent to Earth. Right? So when you're traveling through the line screen adaptation of your Earth, XT1000s following you in tractions, protecting Earth and 4 lines of signals into your networks is setting and traffications. So the Earth comes in rotation, out through equations, and higher lines of networks and screen adaptation. Setting communication high centers over cross locations, setting every data. Your symbolism lines of letters, numbers, shapes, and symbols. Add lines of data frames and line positioning networks to know exactly what you're doing in seconds, minutes, and hours in process communication. Boom, your Skynet. All through storage, all through facility. Hooah! Okay, it doesn't get any more powerful than that, right? So you guys are back in your provisions and settings. So I hope you guys had fun going through those networks. See you on the flip side. Boom.